This is It's Gonna Be Okay with Dr. Roseann, and today we're talking about pathological demand avoidance. What is it? What does it look like? How is it different from autism spectrum disorder? You have never heard of pathological demand avoidance, or PDA is what we're going to be calling it. But PDA, it's a clinical condition that is very much related to autism spectrum disorder, often considered under the umbrella of autism. And it is not recognized in the United States, but it is extensively in Europe. There's a lot of reasons why, but ultimately we've chosen to name autism spectrum disorder, and instead of creating individual different subconditions like Asperger's, I think NVLD should be in there, PDA, now we have AUDHD. Instead of creating individual disorders, we've decided to just put it under one umbrella. I think for most people, it would be better to have an understanding that encapsulates the individual needs. But today we're going to talk about what it is, what are the signs and symptoms of PDA, because I think it is something that is really out there in the world, and it would be very helpful for parents to understand, why do I have this kid who has pathological demand avoidance? So the main symptom of PDA is resisting and avoiding the ordinary demands of life, right? So you're going to have social difficulties just like you have in autism, different in a different way, but you are resistant. This is the kid like where parents are like, I could offer this kid $1 million. And he or she is resistant. I can't motivate them. There's nothing they want. And I think back over to my 3 decades, there's definitely been kids where I'm like, "Ah, now I know they have PDA." They also show extreme emotions when they feel there's a lack of control. You don't always see that in autism and not in the same way. So let's talk about PDA versus autism because it helps us to really distinguish what PDA is. Now, remember, really the crux of PDA is like resisting and avoiding just sort of everyday demands, right? And making things much harder, right? And there's even a little overlap with rejection sensitive dysphoria, where you have extreme reactions to perceived or real criticism. But in that case, we know there's a trigger. With PDA, we don't really know what the trigger is. We just know there's an avoidance for most things, everyday demands, right? So one of the big different the common parts between autism and PDA is social difficulties. They both have social difficulties. With autism, the social difficulties are more extreme. With PDA, there can actually be some skills there, right? And we'll talk about how that's different. But one of the biggest differences with PDA is that they actually often can do role play and pretend play. And in fact, they may do it to the extreme where they're always doing pretend play. They're always doing role play to the point where you can't sort of pull them out. Sometimes I know, like, I wish I could hear, be in contact and having a conversation when a parent's like, oh my God, that sounds exactly like my kid. But again, the difference is they both have those social difficulties, but kids with PDA, it's to a lesser extreme. And in fact, what they often do is they use social avoidance to get away out of doing things too. They're very strategic, kids with PDA, in their ability to resist things. Sometimes people use the words manipulative. I don't look at it that way. They're just acting on an innate way to avoid pretty much anything, right? These are kids that are tough to find things that they actually like, right? So their response to everyday demands seem very out of place, right? Where my kids on the spectrum, I'm not saying they're open to everything, but I can get routine and structure. They tend to respond better to traditional autism treatments. Kids with PDA seem to not respond to traditional autism treatments, including ABA. And everyone has their feelings about ABA, but sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's terrible. So I'm never going to say don't do it. It's a natural therapy, and sometimes it's really can be helpful. So kids with PDA are more prone to emotional outbursts, right? Outbursts. They tend to come because they have anxiety driven by a need for control. So if things don't go their way, they may have just these extreme outbursts. I have a kid with PDA I'm working with right now. And in many ways, his mom's like, he's the least impaired of the bunch. She has a bunch of autistics, but he makes everybody feel uncomfortable because he's just so emotional, right? We were able to regulate and calm him with some PEMF and some neurofeedback, and he's doing better, but he still is very reactive, but it's much, much better. So they are prone to, as I mentioned, either socially earlier, socially strategic behavior. And that means that they know how to strategize and get out of things, right? So they're very clever about avoiding. And again, that's their brain driving that, different from autism, right? Kids with autism are just feeling things and reacting, where kids with PDA are like, heck no, it's not happening. I'm not doing it. And, they're just so anxious if they're not in control, right? So PDA, I do think will wind up eventually being a condition that's accepted in the United States. I think it's going to take a lot of time for it to actually show up in the diagnostic statistical manual. I mean, executive functioning dysfunction isn't in there. I mean, I think ADHD, autism needs to be broken up so that there's more categories so people can understand their child better. I hope this was helpful. I think you're going to hear more about pathological demand avoidance because as we have such a dramatic increase in autism births, it's 1 in 27 boys right now. It's 1 in 44 births, I think. That keeps moving up. I can't keep track. So it's increasingly common. And within 10 years, it will be 1 in 27 births of kids, male and female. So if you're looking for more support about PDA, autism, ADHD, any of these neurodivergent conditions, go to drroseann.com/help. Fill out the solution matcher. It's going to match you to the best solution to what you need. And more importantly, you're going to get on our list. You're going to get really valuable emails with juicy, nugget filled bits of information to support your child and your family.